Hello, everybody. Welcome to this wonderful book launch for Karen Kilby's new book, God, Evil and the Limits of Theology. We're delighted that so many of you have been able to join us today for this launch. There are currently 211 people with us and the number is rising as I speak. My name is Simon Oliver. I'm Van Mildert Professor of Divinity here at Durham University in the UK. And I'm very pleased to be chairing this evening's book launch on behalf of the Centre for Catholic Studies at Durham. The Centre celebrated its 10th anniversary in 2017, and it is the UK's major centre for research in Catholic history, culture and theology. One of the most valuable aspects of the Centre's work is partnership with the Church and with religious orders, as well as gathering together numerous scholars from many different disciplines around its core research activity. We may hear a little bit more about that later on. Okay, so we are clearly here to talk about Karen's wonderful work and her new book, and we have two respondents, two eminent theologians as respondents who are joining us as well. I'd like to introduce them. Firstly, Linn Tonstad, who's Professor of Theology, Religion and Sexuality at Yale Divinity School. Many of us have learned so much from Linn's book, God and Difference, the Trinity, Sexuality and the Transformation of Finitude, which made such a huge impact on the field when it was published in 2016. Her most recent book is Queer Theology Beyond Apologetics. So welcome to Linn. We're delighted you can join us, Linn. Thank you. And secondly, our second respondent is Katherine Sonderegger, who's the William Mead Chair of Systematic Theology at Virginia Theological Seminary. The first volume of Kate's Systematic Theology on the Doctrine of God appeared in 2015. That first volume has been hugely influential. I particularly like Jim Buckley's comment on the back of that first volume. He says, Professor Sonderegger opens new vistas on the doctrine of God by doing what almost no one, with the possible exception of Barth, has done so well, making the perfections of God exciting. What an achievement. The second volume of Kate's Systematic Theology, The Doctrine of the Holy Trinity, Processions and Persons, will be published very early in 2021. So thank you to Linn and to Kate for joining us today as respondents to Karen's book. I'd also like to welcome two other wonderful guests. Firstly, we're very privileged and delighted to have with us Catherine Tanner, who was Karen's first theology teacher, doctoral advisor. So we're delighted that Kathy joins us today. You're very welcome. And also the last person I'd like to specifically welcome is Karen's mother, Mrs. Kilby, doubtless her greatest fan, and we're delighted that she joins us today as well. So to Karen Kilby and her book, let me introduce her. As you know, Karen is Professor Bede Professor of Catholic Theology here at Durham University, and over the last 20 years, she's gained an outstanding international reputation for her work in four specific areas, two concerned with key theologians and two more thematic. The first is modern Catholic theology, and particularly Karen's scholarship in the study of Karl Rahner and Hans Urs von Balthasar has been particularly formative for many of us. The second is Thomas Aquinas and the Thomist schools of thought. The third is Trinitarian theology. And the fourth, the main focus of her current research, is evil and the human experience of suffering. All of those themes are reflected in the 11 chapters of her new book, God, Evil and the Limits of Theology. There is, however, I think, a crimson thread that runs through Karen's work and all the chapters of her book. And it's this, it's divine mystery and the apophatic. She begins the introduction of her new book with a quotation from Augustine's Sermon 117. If you understand it, it is not God. She goes on, how does one engage in a mode of inquiry, an inquiry which includes argument, disagreement, and debate, if one presumes in advance that the thing, in big inverted commas, under discussion, namely God, is and must remain mysterious and beyond understanding? This is a question which makes itself felt, Karen writes, across all theology. It is not an issue which can simply be delegated to those who examine a specifically apophatic tradition. Her work and her book is at heart, I think, a beautiful, appropriately cautious but bold answer to that question which confronts everyone who seeks to be a theologian, entering the mystery of God. I've worked with Karen for the last 11 years at the University of Nottingham and now at Durham. And what I think so many of us find so valuable about her as a theologian, a writer, a colleague, and a friend is her extraordinary learning, her intelligence, and her generous wisdom. She's a most formidable interlocutor over lunch, with a frighteningly quick and incisive mind, a wise counsellor I know very well, and a very gracious friend. And I see all those qualities in every chapter of her new book. So it's a huge privilege and an honour to formally launch Karen's new book, God, Evil, and the Limits of Theology, and to offer her our thanks and our congratulations. Thank you, Karen. What we're going to do just for a few moments is I'm going to talk to Karen a little bit about how the book came to be before we go into our first session in the breakout room. So Karen's going to unmute herself and join me now while I just ask her a couple of questions that will give us some insight into the building of the book. Karen, we know that the essays were written over many years, and they are therefore the result of very considered reflection on a lot of very complex issues. Can you give us some sense of how the book came to be?
Thanks for the question, Simon. Thanks for such a gracious introduction, which didn't quite make me feel like I was listening to the eulogy at my own funeral. So you managed to avoid that, but it came close. But thank you. It's very nice. This book sort of surprised me in coming into being because the particular pieces of it mostly felt like interruptions to something else. I'd be busy feeling guilty about not making progress on writing a book on Karl Rahner or Hans Urs von Balthasar, but somebody would come along and ask me to speak at a conference or to contribute to some particular project. So I'd get distracted from the real work and do a particular essay. And the thing I found was that very often in these distractions and in being drawn in one direction or another by the particular invitations that came along, I seemed to keep hovering around the same themes, and whatever question I started on, I seemed to keep returning to a similar theme. So that's in a sense the genesis of the book, realizing that this set of mostly of distractions, some of which have been published and some of which haven't previously, but all of which have been delivered as papers somewhere. But these distractions actually circle around a theme, hover around a certain set of questions, and so maybe I was accidentally writing a book when I thought I was being distracted from other books.
And can you tell us, you've got 11 chapters, they cover these central themes I was talking about. Do you see them as 11 individual essays or as a coherent whole, as a single book?
That's a question I keep asking myself, and I'm not quite sure. So I'm quite interested to see how the book will be received by its readers. In the sense, as I say, they mostly hover around the same question and come at it from different angles. And I was a little worried when I began to put it together that I would just have been repeating myself. And I don't think I was repeating myself too much, and I think they do more or less cumulatively add up. Certainly within the book, there's there's a SETI stand on the doctrine of the Trinity, and there's a cluster of things on evil, and there's a final essay on mathematical analogies or mathematical thoughts, I suppose, for theology that I hope brings it together to some extent. So I hope it's one book, and I'm actually waiting for the reception of readers to tell me whether it is or not in the end.
I mean, one comment you make in the introduction, which I think is quite nice, is that there's something slightly diffident about the essay genre itself. That you know, if you've got this sense of hesitation about speaking about God at all, about being very careful, and you seem to exemplify that, I think, very, very effectively in the way that, in the beautiful, clear way that you write essays. But I certainly can detect a very clear thread right through them all, and a clarifying position. And thinking about that position, do you sense that over the period in which these pieces were written, 20 years, your position or perspective has changed significantly in that time?
So that's a tricky question as well. I think in part my confidence has shifted so that there are some areas where early in my life I thought I'm just not working hard enough, or I'm not clever enough to understand some kinds of things that other theologians say. And gradually I built up the confidence to think it wasn't always me that was not understanding, but there was a limit to what anybody was understanding on some of these issues. There's one very particular change that's actually the result of you, Simon, because you pointed out, without using the word, but you pointed out a accidental heresy in the very first of these essays, which I managed to correct in the third one. And there's one, the first essay I wrote on evil. It was by invitation. The Catholic Theological Association of Great Britain was talking about evil that year. They asked me to come. I had already turned them down a previous year. I thought I had to find something to say. So I just about found one thing to say about evil. And afterwards, an editor said, "Oh, I really liked your essay. Do you think you could write a book on that?" And I said, no, absolutely not. I've said every last thing, every last thought I have on this topic is in that one 11-page essay or whatever it was. And that's something that shifted, because I have unfortunately kept finding myself coming back to evil, sin, and suffering. And I now think that there is more work to be done there. And
that's what you're doing at the moment, which is
fantastic. That's what I'm doing at the moment.
Okay, brilliant. Linn, I wonder if I could invite you to make your contribution at this stage.
In the spring, I taught a course with a colleague on recent works in theology that left more than one doctoral student questioning whether in embarking on study in this field, they had made an irreparable mistake. Had we been able to assign Karen's God, evil, and the limits of theology as emblematic of the state of the field, the reaction would have been very different. Yet it's arguably in the way God, evil, and the limits of theology does not represent the state of systematic theology that the book's many virtues become most apparent. One can only wish that theology looked more like it does in this text. It may seem mild praise to note how so not irritating this volume is, but it is very much the opposite. Karen Kilby is unusual among the first rank of academic theologians in that her influence, despite having written several very fine monographs, comes in large part from essays, several of which are reprinted in this volume. Perichoresis and Projection was first published at a time when social Trinitarianism had yet to reach its apogee, yet remains as clear and helpful a discussion of the relevant issues as can be imagined. I first read an early version of Aquinas, the Trinity, and the Limits of Understanding in graduate school, a heavily marked up, hear this, grad students, paper copy of which remains in my Aquinas folder. God and Difference was, among other things, an attempt to show that an apophatic Trinitarianism was indeed possible. However, we might rate that project on an apophatic scale, as it were. In short, like many others, I have found that the limits that Karen sets to her projects is part of what makes them so long-lasting and compelling. But rather than limits, I was tempted to say modesty, for modesty holds a prominent place among the many virtues Karen not only commends, but displays in, I will add, stark contrast to the vast majority of theologians who recommend modesty and humility for others in the most forceful and self-aggrandizing of ways. But limits, including especially the limits of the professional theologian, are at the heart of the clear and systematic project that emerges through this series of essays that, read together, offer one of the most compelling visions for theology that I have encountered in some time. Rather than worrying, as many theologians do, about the tendency of non-Christians and non-theologians to value power, control, and mastery, Karen worries about the tendency of Christian theologians to credit our own piety, our own thinking and insights with greater spiritual and transformative power than we ought. Though she puts this much more positively than I do, an instance of her instinctive Catholicism and my instinctive Protestantism lending distinctive slants to a shared concern. Without dramatizing, but in thoroughly deflationary ways, deflationary, one might say, precisely in their kind, modest directness, Karen describes what theologians often do, the motivations that cause us to undertake such projects, the mistakes we make in so doing, their consequences, and the chastened alternative she proposes. To take only one example, her discussion, 2 short pages long, of the role of robustness in Trinitarian discourse and its idolatrous dangers, summarizes and skewers not only the by now much derided social Trinitarians, but, without naming many names, so many others who undertake robust recoveries of Christian distinctives in service of opposing Enlightenment liberalism, and who, in so doing, claim adherence to a tradition that they are often dramatically reshaping in ways, Karen says, that presuppose a rather elevated conception of the role of both theology and the theologian. Rather than abandoning apologetics, as is often claimed, the robust offering of a confident, unapologetic Christian specificity is, Karen says, actually very well suited to a kind of apologetics, since one has something new, something special and concrete to present in the marketplace of ideas. We theologians have finally justified our salaries, she says. Now, I believe this was written before the pandemic, at which point it has now become much more difficult for us to justify our salaries, but that's as may be. Here, as throughout, Karen resolutely refuses any epistemic or spiritual privilege for the professional theologian, although she acknowledges that a theologian may perhaps enjoy the one advantage of sometimes coming across theological ideas that might, from time to time, provoke one to prayer. I want to highlight just 2 of the many moments at which Karen offers a vision of theology that gave this very tired systematic theologian a breath, a respite, a feeling that there might be reason to carry on with this work. The first concerns suffering, the second, the nature of theology, and especially the doctrine of God. It is frightening how unusual it has become to see theologians ask as straightforwardly as Karen does, is it possible for a theology to refuse to grant any intrinsic positive value to suffering and loss while remaining a genuinely Christian theology? She writes against the tendency found among liberals and the robust alike to want to make suffering, if not an absolute good, then at least something beyond which no Christian word can be said. Discussing one such strategy, Karen dryly notes that it does not, of course, cost the theologian anything to attribute any level of suffering to God that she pleases, but it does give her an easy way to take suffering seriously, and perhaps even to feel that she herself is siding with the victim. In this book and several recent essays published elsewhere, Karen manages what I have come to consider a nearly impossible feat. She holds to the testimony of those who find meaning and growth in suffering without compromising commitment to the idea that the cross is oriented toward resurrection. She is able to do this because, I would argue, of her understanding of the nature of theology and the doctrine of God. There are points, she says, at which systematic theology, if there is such a thing, her parenthesis, ought to be, if not systematically incoherent, then at least systematically dissonant. Not too long ago, I was speaking to a highly influential and well-respected colleague at another institution who asked how I understood the task of theology, its nature as an intellectual discipline. In response, I talked about how compelled I am by that which escapes understanding, the disciplined undisciplining of the mind that theology requires, the challenge that it poses to my strategies for control, including the very strategies by which I seek, in good and traditional Protestant fashion, to forestall God's judgment on me by uttering it on myself, one of the deepest forms of idolatry. It was immediately apparent that the conversation was over. This answer had placed me outside what my colleague understood as the nature of an intellectual discipline as such. This is not, of course, the same reaction that introductory theology students sometimes display when introduced to the variability that constitutes the Christian tradition, in which refuge is quickly taken in, oh, well, humans can't understand God, he is above our understanding. But the limits of theology to which Karen takes us are reached at the utmost limits of the attempt to understand, at the place where theology and contemplation meet. For in theology, she says, one can never kick away the latter. One cannot understand the higher level of abstraction in any other way than always in relation to what it is abstracted from. Indeed, it has no purpose, no interest except in that relation. This distinct intellectual asceticism, as she calls it, shows up at points where theology, blessedly, becomes most itself, its failures. Regarding the Trinity, for example, famous words that these are, one should renounce the very idea that the point of the doctrine is to give insight into God, say it louder. Regarding Aquinas' Trinitarianism, some of what Thomas lays out is best understood in terms of theology reaching its limits, in terms, to put it very bluntly, of the dead ends of theology. Karen leaves us here. What we need as theologians is not to block certain questions, nor to drop the search for clarity, but to seek greater clarity still, she insists. Clarity about the reasons that in any given instance one might seek understanding, and the reasons why at times one might not. This vision of theology, a warning against knowing too much without in any way devaluing the search for understanding, places, in fidelity to Karen's Ronarian sympathies, mystery, thus also God, at the heart of the way the theological task escapes those of us engaged in it. And last, but by no means least, academic friends, the book has footnotes. First take out a mortgage on your house, take and read. Thank you.
Thanks, Lynn, that's fantastic. This book is so not annoying. That's I think that's the best blurb. Unfortunately, the whole theological world is here, so I'll never be able to use that, but that's fantastic, Lynn. Thanks ever so much. I don't think Kate's been able to join us, so I have been told that Kathy Tanner may be willing just to step in and make a couple of comments. Kathy, would that be possible? Would you be willing just to supplement what Lynn's just said before we go into our breakout rooms?
I don't know that it would be much of a supplement, but I can ask a few questions that might be conversation starters.
Sure.
It's an incredibly lovely book that I learned a great deal from, and I'm still wrestling with a lot of it. But one question that occurs to me, and maybe it's a bit academic, but I was wondering if Karen could say a little bit more about how she would situate her own apophatic theology and the practice of it in relationship to other forms of apophatic theology on the current scene. For example, say Rowan Williams in The Edge of Words. As I understand the practice of apophatic theology, as Karen is putting it forward, there are certain questions that need to be asked, but one has to recognize they can't be answered. There's as Lynn was saying, the pretension to gain greater meaning is being deflated. There's there's also recognition of certain dead ends that one can't move beyond. but there are clearly other understandings, like, for example, Rowan Williams's about what a practice of apophatic theology would look like, where it has more to do with a kind of unending effort to make greater sense, with a recognition that you're never going to come to the end of that process, and that every statement is revisable, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't know, that's just an open-ended question about the practice of apophatic theology and exactly what it looks like relative to other ones. Another question just about the genre of the text. I mean, Karen has mentioned that these were essays, I mean, they're occasional essays. They were produced for particular purposes. I'm just wondering if, I know Karen is working on another text on suffering and evil, but if she were to rewrite this text, you know, as not a series of occasional essays, I mean, what would it look like? Or, I mean, is this not simply accidental, but that this genre is quite appropriate to the way in which an apophatic theology has to be pursued? And then maybe a third question, just, you know, some of the political ramifications of the position. Some being muted. The political ramification, I was quite taken with the idea of fidelity to the real, and the way in which theological inquiry could encourage that kind of faithful attention, and whether there's more to be said there that Karen would like to add. There are all kinds of other questions, but maybe I should just leave it at that.
Great, thanks, Kathy, ever so much. That's fabulous. So what we're going to do now is, I'm delighted to say that Katherine Sonderegger is with us, which is wonderful. So welcome to her. And what I'd like to do, Kate, is invite you to make your comments, and then we're going to have a three-way conversation with Lynn and Karen. We're going to ask people to send in their questions by the chat. Please start doing that now, and we can start filtering those questions. So Kate, it's over to you. Welcome. Wonderful to see you.
One of the things that I wanted to talk about, and I hope this will pick up on some themes that Lynn raised earlier. I'm really sorry that I wasn't here to hear her comments, but I'm very interested in your reflections on modernism and the modern world, Karen. I thought your essays, of course, on Balthasar have been extraordinary on this theme, but I was particularly intrigued and moved by your essay on what we can learn from contemporary post-Haskalah Jews on the significance of the modern world and the demystification of the world. And I wonder whether this is a more general theme. Are you thinking that the modern world is something that we as theologians need to take seriously on its own terms in a kind of broad way? Or are you thinking of it in a more narrow and particular sense, that this particular idea about the disenchantment of the world is the one that we should take on board? I have other questions as well, but do you want to start there? Do we have in mind?
I think what we'll do, Kate, is we'll stack the questions up and then put those into the discussion when we get that going, if that's okay.
Okay, great. Then I was thinking about your rich and profound reflections on evil, and how we are to regard the whole project of theodicy. I take you to be looking for this via media, this way of, perhaps this is another instance of taking the modern world seriously, taking this attempt to fully encounter and think through the reality of evil, and to consider the search for a response, something significant and worthy in its own right, that it has its own particular dignity, but an answer of the kind that we might see in Leibniz, and maybe in a different way, that this more logical approach of Plantinga is more than you would want to say. That there are certain questions that are simply aporia for us, and that this is one. And then finally, I thought your essay on mathematics was extraordinarily rich and intriguing. I'm interested particularly in the concept of infinity, Cantor's own work, and the way in which you picked this up. This was another, I thought, another element of the modern world that I saw in your work, and the way in which infinity now comes to play a positive, though controverted, place in contemporary mathematics. And whether this does not allow us to speak of mystery in a way that is a positive predicate. And I took you to be following Rahner here in thinking of infinity as a positive predicate that not only means human incomprehension of the divine, but that the divine itself is absolute mystery. So that all of that made me think that that perhaps Rahner is playing a more constitutive role in your own theology and in the way you're thinking about how the living tradition is to take its place in church and academy these days. I think they're wonderful essays. I want, if I have one more moment, I just want to sing your praises for the clarity of these essays. It's part of the profound pleasure of reading your work that you are making deep points and making them not as Bourdieu does, but as you do, making them plain, making them crystalline, so that we can see the force of these deep structures, and we can see what is at stake when we take or put them to one side. And that allows you also to have this wonderful trait of a theologian, to also be witty in what you write, and there is not enough of that in theology too. So I'm intrigued and instructed by the force of your argument, by your encounter with the world that shapes us, and by the infinite mystery of the God who calls us to this task. Thank you, Karen.
Thank you very much, Kate. That was wonderful. I think what we should probably do now is invite Linn to come in to join us. And Karen, do you want to give an initial response and go that way?
Okay, yeah, thank you. Thank you to everyone for coming, and thank you so much to Linn and Kathy and Kate for the very generous comments. I think I've got about 3 questions so far from Kathy and 3 from Katherine Sonderegger. So I'll do what I can with them. So one question was, is my style of doing apophatic theology, have I thought about how it relates to other people's style, and in particular Rowan Williams, which Kathy described as the unending effort to make an unending effort to make a bit more sense, but it's endlessly revisable. So one is moving and making progress, but never in a definitive way. I suppose that part of what I was exploring in some of this work is that not every kind of unknowing is the same. There isn't a one kind of limit or silence theologically. I shouldn't go on too long here, but so there's one kind of a blankness in front of overwhelming evil that we have. There's another kind in front of getting stuck or getting to dead ends on certain part of Trinitarian theology. And when you try to push it too far, you're just into pure speculation. And then there's another kind that's associated with contemplation of the infinite mystery of God, and which is not necessarily contemplation of the kind of historically given technicalities of Trinitarian theology. And so partly I'm trying to distinguish different kinds of being at the edge and being at the limit. And yeah, to pursue that in answer to that question. Second and third questions from Kathy Tanner are very good questions to come from a former teacher. And I have to say, I was really struck when rereading my own essays about how Kathy Tanner is all over my footnotes. So her influence on me is even bigger than I had realized. And she remains in the role to me of the prodding teacher. So, her second question was saying, what would have happened if I had rewritten this series of essays as a single book? What would it look like? Or is there something accidental to its nature as this set of occasionally written essays, or is it somehow appropriate to be in that way? And again, that's a question I partly want to defer to readers to tell me. I did for a while think I should stop being so lazy and I should go back and I should see how all this material fits together into a single book. And to what degree it was simply laziness that I thought, no, it will do as it is, more or less, or quite close. And to what degree it's that my own thinking is naturally the thinking of an essayist and works best that way. And to what degree, as Linn was kindly saying, quoting from myself, I guess, that there's something about the nature of the topic where the testing from different directions is a more appropriate response to the topic of what are the limits of our knowledge than having a grand theory. I still don't know. So I have to await the judgment of my teachers and my students and my other readers about whether this is an act of laziness to propagate this book as it is, rather than writing it properly. And the other teacherly question from Kathy is the political side is a little bit undercooked here. And I think that's absolutely right, that the older I get, the more I realize that I am I haven't worked hard enough at making explicit and thinking through the implicit politics of what I'm doing, and the implicit political overtones. And I did it in one essay on the doctrine of the Trinity, which Kathy was referring to, and there's probably room for me to do more of that in the longer term. In response to, I'll try to be briefer, to Katherine Sonderegger's questions, yeah, it's probably true that Rahner is more present and to my thought than is fully footnoted in this book. He comes in a few places, but I think certainly on mystery, I really like the position that Rahner takes, and I like his way of doing theology. He's also a natural essayist. And he was a very, I spent a lot of time in my earlier years working on Rahner, and think something about the spiritual demeanor of his theology and the ecclesial demeanor of his theology is one that I really like. And his attitude towards the modern world, to tie this to the other question that Kate was asking me, I quite like, because I think he's never inclined to say we either embrace modernity or we reject modernity, or, the world of our time, what you want to call it, post-modernity, that works equally well, so much as that we are inescapably in our time and we're already shaped by it, and we have to think about how to negotiate that rather than grandstanding in one direction or another towards it, I think. But the line of thought that a certain strand of modern Jewish philosophy opens up towards seeing modernity as a gift of Judaism, I find fascinating, and the kind of anti-pagan implications of that. I do just find that very interesting. I don't know that I've got to the end of thinking with that strand of modern Jewish thought. And yes, I suppose to link that as well on theodicy, I suppose that I'm also saying there is something to the modern instinct to be worried about evil and suffering in a way that the pre-modern tradition often didn't seem to be. And even though many of the theodicies, or all of the confident theodicies that are produced, there seems to be something very wrong with them, and theologians rightly tend to reject them, there is nevertheless something authentic in the worry and the questioning that underlies them, and dismissing that along with the rest is a mistake, I think. So there is a kind of via media position that I'm taking on the theodicy question. Right, I'll pause there.
Kate and Lynn, do come in.
Well, one question in terms of Kate's bringing up the essay that you have in here on a certain modern Jewish critique of Christianity as tending towards paganism. I mean, it's going to be interesting if you do develop that line of thinking further, to think about that in relation to the recognition of the sort of intertwining of Christianity's internal critique of paganism with racialization and the sort of structure of racialization in modernity. And whether that critique, what it means to, in a way, take that critique and make it internal to Christianity in a certain way. Will that almost inevitably repeat? I shouldn't say that, that's too much a yes/no question. Is it at risk of repeating, perhaps, the way in which Christianity makes progress by a certain style of critique of its religious other, right? That has ended up being heavily intertwined with the structure of racialization? Or is there something that Christianity ought to recognize in its own practices that is the target here of the sort of pagan concern? So that's one question thinking about. In general, I mean, I do want to say one word in relation to Kathy's question on the structure of the book, because of course, having read many of these essays in the past, and in some cases in one version or another, rereading in preparation for this conversation, I'm laying in a very strong vote that it's very definitely a book, right? Because it does exactly that sort of illuminating work from different directions. And I think in some ways it is the essay as attempt sort of style of the writing that allows the systematicity to have the sort of gentleness that it has, rather than in a way to be this sort of overbearing project where you have laid out in advance. And you know, I think a lot these days, as many of you know, on the relation between theology and genre. And one of the things that I have am making the case for in some of my own thinking and writing is that the genre of systematic theological writing is one of the reasons it struggles so much on central theological theopolitical questions, gender, sexuality, race in particular. And a question I left for myself after reviewing the text was whether your writing has some capacity to be a model for what a sort of a more abstract theological writing that's nonetheless politically sensitive in potentia, at least, right? Because the political sensitivity that you're talking about comes in part precisely from and in relation to the way that your apophaticism is oriented towards a very strong reality sense about God and God's work in the world and the sort of way in which the believer finds herself inside the Trinity rather than objectifying the Trinity in certain ways. And you know, that style of thinking in particular, that sort of internality in the Trinity has often been deeply apolitical, or even maybe more accurately, deeply invested in a negative politics, in the worst of modernity, right? Because modernity and anti-modernity, right, two sides of a coin, they end up making up a single whole. Anyway, a few things that I'd love to keep talking about.
I'm glad you've got a vote for it being a book. I need to think about what you're saying about race and paganism. I just haven't worked on it enough, but my first thought is that it might be quite a specific understanding of what paganism is in the thought of this strand of modern Jewish thought. You'd have to look at whether it's the same one as kind of colonial Christianity worked with, or what the connections, but that does require more thought. And I suppose, how to write a big book without becoming overly dogmatic and overly systematized and overly harsh is a strain for my thinking. So I do maybe enjoy the essay form in that way.
Can I just add that I think Rosenzweig has some discussions in that section on paganism, on race, and on the significance of paganism being a kind of racialism. So that there might be some specific material there.
Karen, can I just pose you one question from the chat that's come in? It's lengthy, but I'll try and put it succinctly, which is really about the suffering of Christ in relation to what you say about evil and suffering, and how you understand that in the context of a rejection of the idea that God foreordains evil for the sake of greater goods.
So there's a line in, as a good Catholic, I can never quote the Bible exactly, but there's a line in Romans somewhere that said, when sin abounds, grace abounds the more. And does that mean sin's a good thing? Absolutely not. Something like that. So that God brings good out of suffering, and even that there's some, in the fallen world that we're in, there's some necessity for Christ's suffering, which good is brought out of, doesn't mean that suffering is good or that we should seek it or that God foreordains it necessarily. So just as we say that greater grace may come where sin abounds, so we can say that unthinkable goodness can come from elements of suffering brought out without the suffering in itself being in the least bit good. Is that answering the question, the foreordination? Yeah, I think so. I suppose I'm of the opinion that in an unfallen world, there would not have been any suffering to the death of Christ if there was a death of Christ, and probably there wouldn't have been a death, but there would have been an incarnation that way. But again, that's being a little bit flat and over systematic, but right. In 30 seconds, that's where.
Excellent, thank you, Karen. We've reached 10 to 7, so we're 5 minutes beyond our time now. So if it's okay with Karen, I will draw things to a close by thanking everybody who has joined us today for this book launch. It's been wonderful to see so many new people to me, but also very, very old friends, hundreds of old friends I haven't seen for a very long time. Can I thank particularly Teresa Phillips and Greg Ryan, who've set this event up, this wonderful event. Thanks to them for their coordination, and a particular thanks to Katherine Sonderegger, Linn Tonstad, and Catherine Tanner for their fabulous contribution to this, which has been excellent. Thank you, all three of you, for your comments and your questions in the discussion. And finally, thank you to Karen for your wonderful book. And those of us who have not yet read it very much look forward to doing so as a matter of urgency. We wish you all a very happy evening, a very happy rest of Wednesday, wherever you are in the world. And thank you once again for joining us here at the Centre for Catholic Studies.